So this chapter, this module, we're going to have a conversation about a very useful module called Express. All right. So Express is a module that takes the functionality that we already have in the HTTP module that we've looked extensively with, but it's going to take that functionality and it's going to extend it, adding some additional features for us, such as handling server routes, responses, cookies, and HTTP request statuses. All right, so you probably don't know about or what responses are just yet, but shortly you will, and they're a very important concept for building our web applications. All right. So the first thing you need to do in order to add Express to your projects is to install Express. So we've already seen how to install modules. Now in your book, it's going to show installing Express with a particular version. I have a tendency not to do that. I have a tendency just to run npm install Express. Actually, I think it does just show install Express. So if you just run npm install Express in your project directory, then it's going to install the latest version of Express for you. All right. All right. So let us take a look at what it takes to create a server using Express once we have it installed. So once you install it with npm, it's very simple. We need to first require the Express module, which you see here. All right. And then we need to create an instance of Express and assign it to a variable. So these are the two lines you see here. I'm, I'm importing the module, and then I'm creating an instance of the Express server. All right. And just like with the HTTP version, you have to listen for incoming requests. So here we're setting app.listen. And what's that 80 stand for? I'm sure you know by now. Correct. We're setting our server to listen on port 80. All right. So the three lines at the very minimum, you need to import Express, you need to create an instance of Express, and you need to tell it to listen on some port. All right. So that gives us a server written in Express. All right. Nothing too spectacular there. That really doesn't do much of anything just yet. All right. However, once we get that going, we can configure it to handle routes. All right, so here's our term where we say handle routes. All right, so what is a route? All right, so a route is just a definition of the path portion of the URL. So we looked earlier in the earlier module at the URL, and we said the path portion tells us where to locate a specific file on the file system, or what directory and file name that we're looking for. All right, so a route represents that path that we're going to be looking for. All right. So in order to use Express, we need to define how we're going to handle those routes. All right. So we need to implement a route to handle it. All right. So we can define a route in two parts. All right. So remember, there's two request methods that we work primarily with. One is get, and the other is what? Post. Correct. All right. So we can define routes to handle gets, and we can handle routes to define post. All right. So here you see an example of me defining a route to handle a get. All right. So let's take a look at it. App.get. All right, and it's a function. All right. So our function takes two parameters here. All right. So the first argument is the path that this route is going to respond to. All right. So if you see this slash right here, that just means we're talking about the root directory or the root path. All right. So generally, that's going to be where your index.html page is. All right. So if I were just to type in 127. If I was running this and type in 127.0.0.1 colon 80, because we're port 80, right? Then this method is going to execute because that is the route it is defined to handle. All right. Now the second argument is our callback that grabs the request and the response. So the request and response objects, just like with the HTTP server, are going to be passed as arguments to this callback. All right. So in this case, we're using the response object to send hello from Express back to the server. All right, or back to the client. I'm sorry. All right. So again, this is a route that handles the path, the root path, takes in the request and the response in the callback, and sends hello from Express back to that server. So if we go, let's change directory. Alright, and I go node express listen. Yes. Oh. Probably want to install. If you see that, that means you haven't installed Express. So let's install it real quick. Alright. And let's run that server again. Alright, so if we go to, let's just open up a new window. Alright, there we go. 127, and we're port 80, so I can leave that off. Alright, hello from Express. So by going to the root path, right, it hit that callback and it returned hello from Express. If I were to change that path, I'm going to get an error now because there is no route defined for login. So there is no route defined for that. All right, so let's look at how we would define an additional route to handle login. So if we said app.get, right, and I said index, excuse me, login, because we're looking for login, this corresponds to that route. All right, so what do we need? We need a request and a response to come into the callback. All right, and we'll just fake it for now and send back login page. All right, so now we have a route defined and our page should respond to that. I have to do this real quick. If you run into this issue, restart your server. All right, so let's try login. All right, where's our login not working? There we go. All right, see the path? And so it hit it and it returned what we were looking for. All right. Let's do another one. Let's try to post. The post would be app.post. All right. And if they were using this URL, all right, and we could do save page. All right. And that would handle the post request to the save URL / save URL. All right. So that's how we do gets and posts. All right. So now that we're implementing routes, what can happen is if we did a route for every one of our pages or for every user that was going to try and use our site, and we have a whole lot of routes in this file, and it'd be humongous. So we don't want to go that route. All right. So in order to reduce that number of routes, what we do is we use parameters within our URL. All right. So for instance, if we're going to the login page and we want to log in for a specific user and password, then we'll pass that username and password along with the URL. All right. So we got a couple ways of getting those parameters over to our code or to our root, right? One, we can use a query string. So a query string is generally that standard, question mark key equals value and key equals value that I showed you earlier. All right, so we can use that one. If we use that route, and that's very common, then we need to parse that URL. So which module will we use for that? That's correct, URL.parse. All right. We can also use post params. All right. So when we create a form, right? Generally, when we use a web form and we implement the request, we could use a post request, and then that way we pass the parameters in the body of the request. All right. We can also use regular expressions where we can take the path portion of the route and use the regular expression to parse the URL and store matching expressions as an array of parameters. All right, and I'll show you an example of each of these. Okay, We also use what's called define parameters. All right, so generally we can define a parameter by name, and we put a colon after everything and put the parameter name. All right, or the parameter value in the path portion of the route. All right, so what Expresses is going to do is assign a parameter name to that value when it parses the path. All right, we'll look at an example of that. All right. All right, so let's take a look at passing the parameters as an HTTP query. All right, let's go. All right, so here's our routes. All right, so again, here's an Express server. All right, so we're importing Express. We're importing the URL module. We're creating our instance of Express, and we're setting it to listen on port 80. All right, so we want to respond to our index page, so we set up a route that corresponds to the route, the root. All right, and we're returning just the string get index. All right, now let's say we had a find method, right? Or let's say we had our users could use a link such as find, and they passed in something like this. So you had find, and you had author. So this is a query string example. All right, and had something like A. Tillman and title equals Moby Dick. All right, so we have something like that coming in. All right, so in order to use this, we're going to respond to the find portion of the path. So we set a route for find. Notice we don't need a different route to handle a specific instance. All right, so when our callback comes in, we're going to parse our URL. So you saw an example of this. All right, so we parse the URL and we get the parts. All right, so here, the parts of the URL, the parse returns that query object, remember? All right, so we can take that query object and we can get the values off of it. So here we're going to construct a response. It's just a string. Don't let it throw you off because it looks complex. We got a string, finding book, author. All right, we're grabbing the author off the query. All right, we're concatenating that with the title. We're grabbing the title off the query. So remember, that query object is going to have our params attached to it. All right, and then we're doing a console.log. So we're displaying the original URL, and we're displaying the response, which is going to be this. All right, constructed, and then we're sending the response back to the client. All right. All right, so this is an example. All right, so that's an example using a query string. All right, now this is an example using regular expressions. All right, so let's take a look at the regular expressions. All right, so remember, I don't know if you remember from back in the days in JavaScript, so long ago, that a regular expression is basically a string that matches patterns. All right, and because URLs are usually patterns or match patterns, then we can use regular expressions to match them. All right, so for instance, this URL, so we're saying the route that we want to match, all right, this is the route that we want to match. Remember, that first argument is the route that we want to match, all right? Now, this one is going to match anything that comes in with the route book, all right? And it comes in with, oh gosh, I hate remembering these regular expressions. Any number followed by a colon followed by another number, all right? Any number followed by a colon followed by another number, all right? So let's look at what we're going to do here with it. All right, so our request, right, in response, here's our callback again. All right, so we're going to grab it. In this case, we're using the params array on our request. All right, param 0 is going to contain the first parameter, pass author book. All right, and it's going to be a chapter. We're going to assign that to chapter, so that's going to be our chapter. All right, the second argument, the one after the colon, is going to be our page. All right, so our request object using the regular expression pattern, we were able to parse the different components based on the regular expression. All right, don't expect you to see you use a lot of those. All right. So this one is an example using defined parameters. All right. All right. So let's talk about defined parameters. All right. So sometimes we can structure our data, right? And we will use the actual URL with a particular format. So let's say we were to pass in a request such as user and then slash, and we had a user ID immediately following it, right? So it's saying user is the route we want to request, and we're passing it 1034 as the user ID, all right? So this would work with us. We're saying listen for the user path, any route that contains the user path followed by slash followed by some value, which is going to represent the user ID, then we'll respond to that. All right. So this is how we get those values. Request.param. We're going to ask it for the user ID. It's going to map that to whatever value came in immediately following that we defined here, immediately following the URL. So in that case, that 1034 that we entered. All right. So that is a defined parameter. All right. All right, so we'll stop there for now, talking about parameters, and when we come back, we will talk about using the request object in our application, and we'll talk about using the response object to set the statuses. All right, take care.